Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the kind welcome, and very nice to have you here with us. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for coming and braving the storm. Let me begin by just quickly giving you a little more background about who we are at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. That probably helps a lot. There we go. So we're interested in understanding what do the broad public understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change. How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and the severity of specific kinds of impacts, whether those be droughts or heat waves or flooding or storms, etc. What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And what kinds of behavior are they engaged in around these issues of climate and energy? And so by behavior, we really mean four main types of behavior. How do people use energy at home and on the road? And will they act to save energy at home and on the road? Consumer behavior. Will people prefer products and services that help lower their carbon footprint? Also, to what extent are people willing to express their concerns about climate change through consumer activism, by either rewarding or punishing companies for their actions? And it turns out, I'll just quickly say, that we find that over half the country is willing to reward or punish companies based on their activities. In fact, far more people are willing to be consumer activists than are willing to be political activists. That's a much longer story. Third, we're really interested in how do we talk about this issue? How do we communicate about this issue? As well, and by communicate I mean within our social networks, among our friends, our family, our colleagues, our coworkers, as well as to our wider institutions. And then social norms, these unwritten cultural rules that guide much of our daily life. I just have to pick one example, and that's smoking. Just think about the wholesale massive cultural shift we've seen in this country around smoking. When I grew up, it was still considered cool and glamorous, and that is completely inverted today. And then last but not least is political behavior. To what extent will people not only support policy, but will they express those concerns at the ballot box by preferring one candidate versus another? But also, to what extent are people willing to become engaged citizens? Thank you very much. To actually organize, to demand systemic political change. Okay? And so what leads people to do that? So that's the wide range of things that we focus on. Well then, as social scientists, our fundamental question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with the issue of climate change, other people are apathetic, and other people are outright hostile or dismissive towards the issue? And then to study that, we look at it at lots of different scales. So what I'll talk about here is all at the national scale, but we're working increasingly at the state level, at the city level, and smaller, but also increasingly now internationally. So we've just done the first ever study in China, the first ever study in India, and then with the Gallup World Poll, we've been looking at this in about 130 countries around the world. So we can even look at the global scale. So all of which is to say we spent a lot of time on this question. And I'm happy to go to whatever level people want, but for today, I'm going to really focus in on the United States as a whole. Okay, so what's happening here in the United States around the issue of climate change? How are Americans responding to this issue? Well, let's start with this. So what this chart is showing you is the trends of Americans' belief that climate change is real. Now, what I've done is I've taken the results from every survey organization that has asked a version of this question, is it happening, again and again and again over time. So we know what the trend looks like. Now, they ask the question in different ways, thus you get different estimates. That's why vertically they look different. But that's not what I want you to look at. What I want you to look at is the overall trend. And that is that we saw a rise, a peak in public engagement with the issue of climate change that met a high water mark at around 2007, 2008. And then we saw this dramatic decline, on average about 14 percentage point drop in the proportion of Americans who believe that climate change is happening, bottoming out in about 2010. Since then, it's begun to come back up. We're not back up to where we were in 2007, 2008, but we're definitely coming back. Okay? So that's the big picture. Now we see this in other ways as well, in other measures. Only about half of Americans understand that global warming is mostly human caused. Now, by the way, I should have said, these are all national data. They all come from representative national surveys of the highest, if I may say so, scientific quality. So I'm happy to talk about the details of that if anyone's interested, but for the most part, I'm not going to talk about it here. So only half of Americans understand that it's human caused. Moreover, only about 4 in 10 Americans currently understand that most scientists agree that climate change is even happening. Now note this question doesn't even ask about, is it human caused, is it a serious problem, etc. This is just about the question, do the experts agree that it's happening? Okay? And only 4 out of 10 Americans correctly understand that it's most. And in fact, there have been multiple studies now that have basically all converged on the same finding that it's actually 97% of climate scientists agree that it's happening, that it's human caused, and that it's going to have serious consequences. Okay? 97%. And yet only 4 out of 10 understand that it's most. And further, when we ask, what would you guess, what is your estimate of what proportion of scientists actually agree about this? Only 13% of Americans get it even in the ballpark of 80 to 100%. Okay? So this is a massive misconfusion out there. And it turns out in our research that we've identified this is a particularly important idea. This is what we call a gateway belief. The more you understand this idea, the more in turn people then say, yeah, I agree, it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, and that I support action. And this makes perfect sense from the standpoint of a lay person. I mean, every day we are confronted with thousands of new hazards and risks about which we know nothing, right? I've been studying climate change for 25 years. I know something about that. You asked me to assess the risks of nanotechnology? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that much about it. I'm not that much better than the average lay person. So if your perception is that the scientists are still arguing over whether this is even real, most people's reaction is, oh, okay, I'm going to wait. They'll figure it out. When they do, they'll tell me, and then I'll take it seriously. And it turns out that this, right here, has been the primary strategy of those forces who are opposed to action on climate change. They literally have taken the playbook that was first developed and very successfully used by the tobacco industry. Okay, for decades, we knew back in the 50s that there was a link between tobacco smoking and all sorts of negative health impacts. But they knew that the primary strategy was if you can just keep people thinking that the scientists haven't yet agreed about that, then people will keep smoking. And it took decades of very hard work before finally people said, oh yeah, okay, now I believe it. The scientists do agree. Okay? Same exact strategy with literally some of the exact same scientists that were fighting that war got imported into the climate change debate. So this is a really important misconception. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that in coming months. Okay, so again, that's where we are at the moment. Okay, and moreover, few of us are very worried about this issue. It's gone, it went down as I talked about, come back up a little bit. As of April of this year, it was back down to just 14% of Americans say that they're very worried about this issue. Okay? Now, why is that? Why aren't we worried about it? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but one of the most important reasons is that for many Americans, they still think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears or small island countries. It's not about the United States. It's not about my state. It's not about my community. It's not about my friends and family or any of the people and places that I care about. So yeah, it might be happening, but I don't see why that matters to me, and I certainly don't see why it should be a priority. And this is data from Pew Research Center, that has been asking about people's perceived priorities. What have we always seen? Global warming or climate change is always at the bottom of that list. And since 2007, it dropped 10 points, right in line with what I was showing you before. The environment as a category dropped 5 points. So why? What's going on here? Okay, so now we have one other way that we really, and it's one of my favorite techniques, and I won't go into the underlying psychology of this, but it's a question that we can all play along with. It's a form of free association. So here's a question that I always ask the American public whenever I do a national survey. What's the first thought or image that comes to mind when you hear the term global warming? Now don't say anything. Okay, now just curious, raise your hand if something comes to mind about melting ice. Say sea ice in the Arctic, ice shelves breaking off Antarctica, something like that. Oh, way up high so we can all see it. Okay, so now this happens every time. And the amazing thing is that it happens with a room full of climate scientists just as easily as it does with a member of the general public, okay? Because that's exactly what we find when we ask Americans this more broadly. The first thing most people associate with the term global warming is melting ice. Again, sea ice melting in the Arctic, ice shelves breaking off Antarctica, melting glaciers around the world. Okay, now that's been a good thing in a sense, because what it does is it ties into a fundamental mental model that we have all built up in our brain over repeated experience, okay? And I can just say it this simply. If any of us goes outside on a nice warm day with a glass of ice, what happens? It melts, right? And when you show people pictures of ice melting around the world, especially those wonderful before and after, not so wonderful, but dramatic pictures of melting ice around the world, it resonates with what people already understand intuitively. Yes, the world's warming. Look at the ice melting. You can see it right there. Okay. But it comes with a cost. Now, all those people that were thinking of ice, could you put your hands back up in the air and hold them up? Okay. Now, keep your hand up if you live next to the Arctic Ocean, in Antarctica, or next to a melting glacier. Really? Nobody? Okay. Again, it reinforces the sense that this is far away. This is happening at the poles. This is happening at high altitudes, not where we live. And many people are not connecting the dots to why any of that melting ice matters. Okay, maybe it has some bad things to do for polar bears, but what has that got to do with me? So they get the A, warming causes B, melting. But they don't then go the A, warming causes B, melting, which causes C, sea levels to rise, which causes D, coastal flooding along the Connecticut coast. Okay, and what they definitely aren't doing is saying A, warming causes B, melting, which causes C, changes in the Earth's reflectivity, which causes D, more warming, which causes more melting, which causes more warming, which causes more melting in a runaway positive feedback effect. Okay? And that's actually the thing that, as scientists, we're most concerned about. Because as you melt all that white reflective surface and you replace it with dark ocean or land, you kickstart, you amplify that process of warming. Okay? Most people are not thinking about that at all. Okay, then a lot of people just think, okay, global warming, temperature's going up, heat. Then a lot of people who confuse global warming with the ozone hole. And we see this everywhere. Okay? Many people think that global warming and the ozone hole are actually the same problem. Or, alternatively, some people think that the ozone hole causes global warming. Okay? Now, there's a longer story to that, and that is about the power of metaphor in shaping the way that we perceive and understand the world. And basically, there was a group of scientists that back in the 1970s said, okay, everybody, we've got a problem. There's this problem that our emissions of chlorofluorocarbons are destroying the Earth's protective ozone layer and creating a hole. Now, look at that term, ozone hole. Horrible problem, but what a great term, okay? Because when they did is they gave people this understanding that there's this protective layer, like a roof, protecting all of us down on Earth from harmful ultraviolet light, which, by the way, can cause skin cancer. among many other problems. Okay? And when you use this term, ozone hole, well, if you have a hole in the roof, what are you supposed to do? Patch it. You fix the hole. By contrast, what are you supposed to do with global warming? Or even worse, what are you supposed to do with climate change? These are so abstract, they're so, I mean, what are you going to do? Okay? So first of all, people had this notion that there's this protective layer, and a hole in that protective layer is letting through harmful ultraviolet light. Then another group of scientists come along about 10 years later in the 80s and say, okay, everybody, we got another problem. Okay? And this one we're calling the greenhouse effect. Okay, now most of us stand at about 6 feet and down. We have eyes in the front of our face, not the top of our head. We spend very little time looking up and thinking about what's going on with invisible gases in the atmosphere. Okay? Most of us spend our time at about 12 feet and down. This is the world, not that. So we have limited shelf space devoted to upper atmospheric processes. And what many people did is they took that notion of the ozone hole and they squished it together with this new term, greenhouse effect. And they think, oh, maybe the reason why we have global warming is because there's a hole in the greenhouse. And that's letting more solar radiation in and warming up the planet. Or we even find some people who flip it around, invert it, and say, oh, the heat's going to escape out the hole in outer space and we're going to go into a new ice age. Okay? Perfectly logical, perfectly rational, completely wrong. Okay? This is about how, I mean, this is at the level of what you all work on in terms of your education programs. What are the mental models that we are building in our children through education? So this has been a source of a lot of misunderstanding around this issue. Then what we call alarmist images. These are people who have really extreme visions, apocalyptic visions of what global warming is going to bring, like death of the planet, like after nuclear war, often well beyond the worst case of scientific scenarios. Then flooding, sea level rise, climate change more broadly, impacts on the non-human world, and then at last but not least is a group we call the naysayers. These are people who have different reasons for doubting the reality of climate change. They say it's not happening, they just reject it. They say it could be happening, but it's not been proven yet, so they're kind of arguing about the evidence, but they don't believe it. Then there are those that doubt based on their personal experience. It was minus 20 here last night. Where's your global warming? That can't be true. Those who blame it on environmentalists or the news media trying to hype the story. And then last but not least, those we lovingly call the conspiracy theorists, who say it's a plot, it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's the UN trying to take away American sovereignty, it's Al Gore trying to get rich, and there are many, many other variants of the conspiracy. Okay, one other thing to say about this list, by the way, this data is from 2003, I'm going to show you more recent stuff in a moment, is what we've never seen on here. Nobody ever associates climate change with impacts on human health. Nobody. Not on infectious diseases, not on asthma rates, not on deaths from heat waves, not even the deaths and injuries from extreme events, like hurricanes and storms and floods and so on. Okay? So that is and yet we know that for many people, in fact our studies have shown, that health turns out to be one of those dimensions of this issue that first of all nobody's aware of, but when they are made aware of it, everybody gets it. Across the board, across party, across liberal, conservative, across those who know and those who don't. When you start talking about it in human terms, it's no longer just about polar bears. So we think that the health component of this, which is probably the part that most of us care the most about. Now, this is a different group because you also care about what's going on in the natural world. You're very attuned to that. But that's not, unfortunately, many of your fellow countrymen and women. Okay, where are we as of just a couple years ago? Well, this is what we saw. A big shift. And one category in particular jumped dramatically, and that was the naysayer category. And about half of those are conspiracy type associations of hoax, bogus, etc. Okay, so we've seen some pretty dramatic things happening. So why? What was going on there? Well, there are a lot of different hypotheses out there. We're actually working through it ourselves at the moment. But partly what we think is going on, there was a bit of a perfect storm. There were a lot of things happening in this time period. First of all, the economy. 2008 is the moment that the housing bubble pops, the financial system goes into crisis, the unemployment goes up over 10%, and the economy and jobs soar to the top of public priorities where they have dwarfed everything since. Okay? And climate and energy and abortion and crime and all these other issues that we generally care about dropped in public priority or got pushed right off the table. Okay? So one is, with good reason, people were really worried about something else. What people don't necessarily understand, though, that there was also a huge decline in media coverage of this issue. Our colleagues have been tracking newspaper coverage. Newspaper coverage dropped by 2/3. And I'm not talking about quality of coverage, I just mean number of stories. Likewise, nightly network news coverage, the CBS Evening News, ABC Nightly News, etc., dropped by 90%. Okay? Now this is an issue that we can look out the window and there is CO2 pouring out of tailpipes, it's pouring out of smokestacks, it's pouring out of buildings. It's actually pouring out of each of us right this very second. Right? When you breathe out, that's CO2 coming out. And guess what? You've never probably even thought about that. Okay? Because you can't see it. It's invisible. And likewise, many of the impacts are invisible to us because we don't know where to look. So when and in fact, moreover, the only way most of us even know about this issue is through the media. We don't know climate scientists. We don't read the peer-reviewed literature. We're not reading the IPCC reports, right? I won't even ask people how many of you have read the IPCC reports, because it's not many. So the point is that when the media doesn't report this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. It's not that we've totally forgotten about it, but it's not salient. Okay, we also had some unusual cold weather in this time period. If I can take you back, there was, I always get these backwards, Snowmageddon, and then there was Snowpocalypse. We're running out of these terms. But we do know that for those people who don't pay much attention to this issue, they will draw on their personal experience of weather to make up their mind about whether global warming is real or not. Okay? I'll come back to that. Again, I don't need to say more about the denial industry that definitely went into overdrive during this time period. ClimateGate happened, the stolen emails from the University of East Anglia, which were then cherry-picked and certain phrases were taken out of context and basically used to say, look, scientists are in a big conspiracy, that they're lying to us all, etc. Our own research shows that that had an impact. About 12% of Americans either lost or became less believing that climate change is real or lost trust in climate scientists. But what's interesting about that is that it wasn't universally spread across the American public. It was highly concentrated among people who tend to be conservative, Republican, and to get their news and information from Fox and Rush. Okay? And when we went back and looked at media analyses, we saw that, yeah, all the other networks at least covered the story once or twice, but Fox and Rush talked about it again and again and again and again, far more than anybody else, and always with this very sinister interpretation. Okay? So you're beginning to see these interactions between audience and media source. And to some extent, the echo chamberization, if I can make up a term, of our society. And that makes it harder and harder to have a national discourse. We no longer live in the Walter Cronkite era, where most of us tuned into one person who's actually said at the end of his broadcast, and that's the way it is. Not in 2013. Right? Nobody has an exclusive view on that's the way it is. Okay? Makes it very hard to have all kinds of national conversations, not just climate change. All right, and then increasing political polarization. Basically, we've seen Democrats and Republicans were not very far apart on this issue up until 1997. Let me say that again. Democrats and Republicans were not very far apart from each other until 1997. Can any of us remember a time when we weren't completely fighting with each other? But that's when it started to turn. And it started to come farther and farther and farther apart until we are to today's world, where climate change has become almost a source of identity politics. It's become an issue like abortion, where you are very clearly on one side or another, and it is a way of expressing one's political allegiances beyond simply directly dealing with the issue itself. This has definitely caused a major problem, and it's of course why we can't get national action in the United States, because the two parties have become completely polarized on this. All right. So why have we rebounded since then? Well, some of the things we think are going on is, one, obviously the economy is getting better, not fast enough, but it is getting better. Increasing media coverage over the past couple of years, and in large part that's been because over the past 2 years we have had just an unbelievable succession of record-setting extreme weather events. In 2011, we had 14 individual events that each cost this nation at least $1 billion, for a total of about $54 billion. An all-time record. And then came 2012. And 2012 was yet a whole nother set, the second, I think, only to 2011, of extreme weather disasters, including, for those of us here in this part of the world, Hurricane Sandy. But don't forget we had Hurricane Irene before that. Okay. So, what we're finding is that many Americans are actually connecting the dots themselves. They're saying, and this is as of, I believe, April, about 6 in 10 Americans think that global warming is already affecting weather in the United States. And moreover, they think that it's actually impacting and influencing specific events, like the fact that 2012 was the warmest year on record in the United States, the ongoing drought in the Midwest and the Great Plains, and Superstorm Sandy. Okay. So many Americans are already beginning to think that climate change is affecting the weather. Now, I'm not here to tell you that simply experiencing these kinds of extreme events suddenly convinces people that global warming is happening and serious, and thus we're going to go support policy. No, it's not that simple. But what it does is that these are teachable moments. These are a moment when people are paying attention and actually engaging and asking the question, what is this? Because we're experiencing things that are unprecedented. It's happening in Boulder, Colorado right this very minute. Okay? All-time record-setting flash floods. Okay? And look at the way that that has happened. It's happening in places that were just burned. And because they were burned, the water just rushes off the hillsides and straight into the rivers. Okay? These things we're starting to connect dots. Okay. So the other thing we learned very early in our research is that while we talk about the American public, there is no such thing as the American public. Americans don't agree about climate change, and they don't agree about most other important issues in our society. And so we wanted to figure out who are the different perspectives, or what are the different perspectives on climate change in the United States. And what we've done is we've identified what we call global warming 6 Americans. 6 different groups, very different from each other, but that each respond to this issue in very different ways. So let me introduce you to them. So here's what we found as of last April. We've been tracking this over the past 5 years. The first group is on the left there that we call the alarmed, 16% of the public. These are people who are firmly convinced climate change is real, that it's human caused, that it's a serious problem, as an urgent problem. They're highly supportive of action, but they aren't sure what we can do about it. In fact, that's the question that comes up all the time with them, is what can I do as an individual, and what can we do collectively as a society? Okay? As a community, we have done a far better job, especially with even this group, of conveying the reality and the seriousness of the problem, but not as good of a job helping people understand what the solutions are. Then comes a group that we call the concerned. That's 26% of the country. These are people who think it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but they tend to think it's distant. Again, distant in time, distant in space. So we can deal with that one in 20 years or so when we've got and we've got other things that are higher priority. So they are basically very supportive of action, but they don't see it as a priority. Then a group that we call the cautious, another quarter of the country. These are people who we can think of as fence sitters. They're paying attention, but haven't really made up their mind. Is it happening? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it a serious problem? Is it kind of overblown? Still just making up their mind. Then a group that we call the disengaged, about 5% of the country, and these are people who've heard the term global warming, but they don't know anything about it. Over and over they say, I don't know what the causes are. I don't know what the solutions are. I don't know what the impacts are going to be. Okay, so for them, it's basic awareness. They've just never been properly engaged, even to understand the basics of the issue. Then a group we call the doubtful, 15%. These are people who think, I don't think it's happening, but if it is, it's natural. It's just a natural cycle, nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So I don't really pay that much attention to it, but my predisposition is that this is not really a risk. And then last but not least is a group we call the dismissive. That's about 13%. And again, these are the people who are convinced it's not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem. And again, many of them think it's a conspiracy. Now, note that that's 13%. Let me say that again. The dismissive are only 13%. But there are really loud 13%. There are really vocal 13%. Okay? We've done analyses, and you've seen this, on the comment section on newspaper articles online about climate change. And you look at those comment sections, and you will see that half or more of those comments represent this kind of a perspective. Okay? It's really easy to come away as a member of the public, as a journalist, or as an elected official with the impression, the false impression, that this is half or more of the country. It's not. They're just really good at communicating. By contrast, the alarmed over there, they feel relatively isolated and alone. They say, I feel this strongly, some of my friends and family feel this strongly, but they have no idea that there are about 45 million other Americans who feel as passionate about this issue as they do. And thus they're not organized. Thus, organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby, which are trying to organize. Because that's it. It's about organizing. Okay. So one of the things that we looked at is, well, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? And here's what they say. Over here on the right, they want the doubtful and dismissive, they say, well, how do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, they're asking, and why should I trust you? Whereas the groups in the middle have a different question, different conversations going on in this country. They're saying, okay, maybe it's happening, but so what? What harm is it going to cause? Why should I care? Whereas the alarmed and the concerned are like, okay, I'm with you. It's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but what can we do about it? And increasingly, we're starting to hear the theme, and is it too late? Okay? That's a really disempowering belief right there. To quote Henry Ford, if you think you can, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. So there are three completely different conversations going on in this country all at the same time. Just a couple other things I wanted to point out. One, though, is around policy support. So here I'm just taking out a couple to show. Now, first of all, look at regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. This is the major policy that's currently on the table because Congress will not take action on climate change. So the president is stuck with doing what he can through purely executive order. And that is, in fact, we just heard the beginning of the rules today of laying out what the new rules around coal-fired power plants are going to be. And that's regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And you can see that the six Americas line up exactly as you would expect. The alarmed are very supportive. The dismissive are very much against that. Okay? Likewise, a 20% renewable portfolio standard. This is the idea that at least 20% of electricity has to come from wind or solar or geothermal or hydro or some sort of renewable energy. Again, the alarmed overwhelmingly for it, the dismissive overwhelmingly against. But then you get to the item like renewable energy research. Okay? And everybody supports that. Now, how is that? Okay, now we can understand that the alarmed and the concerned support renewable energy because it's a way of solving climate change, right? But why would the doubtful and the dismissive do that? Because they don't believe climate change even exists. This is the point about how policy actually gets often done. That people can come to support policies for very different reasons. It's an old wonderful saying, there are many roads to Damascus. Okay? People can support the same policy for completely different reasons. The alarmed and concerned, they like renewable energy because it will help deal with environmental and climate problems. The doubtful and dismissive don't believe in climate change, but they see clean energy as crucial for increasing American independence from the fact that we are still reliant for so much of our energy on foreign countries, and in particular foreign countries that aren't particularly democratic or sharing of our values. Okay? Moreover, we see the same thing on fuel-efficient support for instance, rebates for fuel-efficient vehicles and solar panels. Okay? Doubtful and dismissive, they like solar panels too. And I gotta say, having gone through Hurricane Irene and been without power for 10 days, waiting for my central utility to reconnect me, and it took a long time, I wanted my own damn power. Okay? I wanted to be independent. I wanted to be free. Okay? These are values that connect with them in a particularly powerful way. So just to point out that just because we still are fighting over the reality of climate change doesn't mean that we can't support some of the policies that will actually help reduce climate change, but in some cases for different reasons. Okay, last thing I just wanted to point out is back to the alarmed as a potential political force. This is a question we asked last April, and we just simply said, how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? I am willing to join a campaign to convince elected officials to do the right thing about global warming. And what we found is that basically, what is that? 72% of the alarmed said they agreed with that. About 61% of the concerned, and so on, you can see. Now, if you just restrict yourself to the alarmed and the concerned who strongly agree, let's just say that anybody who says, I somewhat agree, they don't really mean it. They would never actually join an organization. And you only talk about that 27 and 5%, that's 17 million people. Okay. Now just to put that into context, how many active members of the Tea Party are there in this country? And I don't mean just like people who say I agree with the Tea Party, I mean people who go to meetings and are part of the organization of the Tea Party. Any guesses? 4 million? What? 5 million? 5 million? Okay, and think about the influence they've had on American politics, right? It's been big. 200,000. 200,000. So for those people who care about this issue and want to organize around it, it doesn't seem to me that that's impossible. It just hasn't been done. It's starting to be done, but it's not done yet. Okay, so to just summarize, as I've talked about, we saw a real drop in public understanding of this issue from 2008 to 2012, and it changed the political climate. Okay? And that's what this really is about now. It's not just about climate change, it's about the political climate. As I titled this talk, it's about climate change in the American mind. There are these 6 different Americas, and they need to be engaged with on their own terms, where they are, not where you are. There are many environmentalists, for example, who got into this issue because they cared passionately about polar bears. That's great. And so then they go to their brother-in-law and say, I want you to care about this issue because look what it's doing to the polar bears. And the brother-in-law says, I don't care about polar bears. What are you talking about? Or worse, a polar bear would eat you if it had the opportunity. I'd kill a polar bear if I had the chance. Okay? what you're trying to do is take away American sovereignty and American liberties and so on, right? It's just a liberal plot. So the values and the arguments that work for us, whoever us is in this case, may not work with others. And that's the critical thing, is to communicate effectively, you need to know who your audience is. Okay. The facts are actively interpreted by these different audiences. Okay? Americans are not just empty vessels waiting to be filled up with facts from the scientific community. It's just not that simple. They come preloaded with a whole bunch of beliefs and attitudes and trusted sources and distrusted sources and so on. All this information about this issue comes into this unbelievably rich and complex social and cultural environment. And that's where people try to draw their interpretations. And they make those interpretations based on what they know or think they know, what their underlying values are, and what their emotional feelings are about these kinds of issues. So knowledge is necessary, absolutely, but it's insufficient. Emotions, values, ideology, and these broader social, political, and economic forces are all part of the mix as well. It's not simply about shouting the scientific facts louder and louder. So we need a lot of different kinds of effective strategies, again, based on who are you trying to reach. That's the first question. Who's your audience? And then how do you meet them where they are, not where you are. But there are some themes that are, I think, more constructive than others. The health impacts, the links to extreme weather, and the fact that we've all been experiencing these things. And crucially, that this problem is solvable. That's a message that has not been conveyed well at all. And that's really unfortunate, because we know that if people simply fear something but don't believe they can do anything about it, the natural human tendency is to not pay attention to it. Why would you? Okay. And with that, if you're interested in learning more about any of our stuff, please come visit us at our website. We have many of these reports available for free, and people can come and learn more. Thank you very much. Do we have time for a couple questions?
Plenty of time.
Okay, great. Any questions? Yes, sir.
The critical issue, though, that's the interesting thing is about what they can do. I think that we, the committee, need real help in learning how to fashion the message. I think that we need help and instruction to do that. That would be the most effective use of our time. That's what it needs to be in terms of my own involvement. Is that a lot of the messages you try, just, so where in your program does that come about?
Okay, great comment. So the question is, or both comment and question is that we need a lot of help in how to talk about this. And what are we doing to help develop answers to that? Well, we're doing a whole lot of things. So one is just understanding who the audiences are and what leads them to the interpretations they currently have or don't have about the issue. And then we do a bunch of other things, like, for instance, we're doing experiments to see how do you convey a particular message the most effectively. So I'll give you one quick example, is we did a study, a national study, where we took the 6 Americas and we randomly assigned them to get one of 3 different ways of talking about climate change. One is climate change is an environmental problem, which has been the primary way that we've talked about it in this country. Either that it's an environmental problem, or alternatively that it's a political problem, that it's about Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other. That's basically the way we have mostly talked about it. And then we also showed another group the issue framed instead as a health issue. And then third, another group that we shared or showed them a message around climate change as a national security issue. Okay? Now, what did we find? The environmental theme works just like we would expect. The alarm to concern, you got me. You had me at polar bears. You know, the doubtful and dismissive, I don't like environmentalists. I'm not one of those tree huggers. I don't like them. they drive me crazy. I'm not for that. The health message worked with everybody, worked across the board. Now, it didn't convince the dismissive. Okay? They didn't suddenly go, oh, now I get it. No. But importantly, it didn't upset them. It didn't make them angry. And believe it or not, that's actually a huge victory. To be able to have a reasonable, constructive conversation where somebody's not immediately on the defensive and throwing rocks at you, that's a win. Last is the national security theme, which we thought, we're smart scientists, right? We thought, okay, national security, we know that many people in the doubtful and dismissive are very conservative, they care a lot about national defense. This is something that's going to appeal to them. And what did we find? The national security theme worked really well with the alarmed and dismissive, because they basically said, look, I was worried about this before, but now you're telling me about all the national security dimensions, now I'm really freaked out. The middle groups were engaged because they were like, okay, it's not just about polar bears, this is about people too. But with the doubtful and dismissive, it caused a huge backlash effect. Okay? Really big backlash effect. Where we actually asked them to go through and tell us how they felt about every sentence in the material we gave them. And what we found is it gave them anger. They were really upset. Okay? Now, we don't know the full reason for that, other than that we know, at least for some of them, they think again of climate change as this communist plot, okay, to take away American liberties. And if you start showing them, here's comments by generals, and here's a comment in a report by the Pentagon saying that climate change is real and a national security threat, we think that at least some of them are saying, oh my God, the commies have taken over the Pentagon, right? I'm pushing that. So, all right. I hope. Oh, well, one other thing, though, I want to say. There's actually an emerging movement in this country right now to ask people to do one of the most simple behaviors, okay? Now, many people can turn out the lights when they leave a room and maybe have changed their light bulbs to something more energy efficient, or maybe you bought a more fuel-efficient car, or you drive a little less. I mean, these are all great things. But it's harder to get somebody to fly to Washington, D.C., knock on the door of their senator and say, damn it, you've got to talk to me and I'm going to tell you about my concerns. That's harder for a lot of people to do. But one of the things that we think is actually the most important behaviors that anybody can do is have a conversation, is talk about it. Because the fact is, we're not talking about it. Our president's not talking about it, our leaders are not talking about it, our churches aren't talking about it, we as a people are not talking about it. And the more we don't talk about it, the less important it becomes. So I think that's actually one of the things that any of us can do, but it comes back to your real question. You've got a lot of different people in your social network, right? I mean, I show that picture of the 6 Americas to people, and people will always come up to me and say, you know what, you just nailed my uncle. You know? Or, that's my brother-in-law. Yeah, it's always your uncles or brothers-in-law. So the point is that we all are embedded in these networks of people, and we're all seeking for ways that we can talk better. But those aren't the only people you need to talk to. Wow, that's some sound effects in the back.
Your focus has been on the U.S. and Americans. Can you summarize a little bit about the rest of the world and their activities?
Sure. Okay, so the question is, can I say something about the rest of the world? I think very important to recognize is the rest of the world is actually much more engaged with this issue than we are. Yes and no. So first of all, 4 out of 10 people on planet Earth have never heard of climate change. 40% of the planet, that's almost 2 billion people, have never heard of climate change. You know, that doesn't mean that they haven't seen changes in their local environments. They have. They tell us they have. But they don't have this concept of climate change to either make sense of what they're currently experiencing, or more importantly, to get prepared for what's coming. Okay? So basic awareness and education is still critical for much of the world. That said, of those people who are aware around the world, this debate that we have in this country is limited really to just 4 countries. The United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK. You don't find it pretty much anywhere else. Now, what's interesting about that? All 4 of those countries are English-speaking countries, and with the exception of the UK, they were all frontier societies. Okay? They were all societies where the cultural myth of rugged individualism, of pioneer spirit, of get out of the way, get off my back, anti-government because I'm going to light out for new territory, and this deep, deep American character is also true of all four of those countries. So we don't know the full answer, but that's at least one of the things we know here in the U.S., that the more individualistic your worldview is, the more you're against climate change action. And so that may be part of what's going on. Last thing I'll just say, though, is that then there's the big other players. People will always say, well, what about India? What about China? You know, we can take action, but what if, you know, they're not going to do anything, so why should we tie our hands behind our back? Americans don't understand what's actually going on in the rest of the world. And look, China's got lots of problems. It's got lots of problems. But at the same time, China invested $65 billion in clean energy last year. $65 billion. You know how much the United States invested? $35 billion. Okay? This is a race for one of the biggest profit centers in human history. There's an estimated $2.6 trillion sitting on the table in just the next 7 years. Okay? Somebody's going to go make that money. And right now the Chinese are already around, they're like already doing a lap, and we're still mostly in the starting block. Okay? The Chinese are instituting a cap and trade system right now in their country. The same cap and trade system that was championed by Republicans in this country, but ultimately the Congress refused to even take up, the Chinese are actually implementing. The Indians have already created a tax on coal, a carbon tax on coal. It's not high enough, but they have one, unlike the United States. So there's actually a lot of very positive things happening in even some of our other major competitors that most of us just aren't aware of, which again is not to in any way deny that they've got their problems too. All right, one more question. Yes? Okay, so the question is, do I know anything about Bill McKibben's organization, 350.org? Sure, of course. So there's a writer turned activist named Bill McKibben who founded an organization called 350.org. And it's become an international organization. 350 refers to the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I'm not sure if that's the name I would have chosen in the end, but nonetheless, it's the goal for what they would like to return the Earth to. By the way, we just, a month or so ago, passed an all-time historic high of 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. We were at 280 just before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So because of our activities, we have pushed it from 280 up to 400. And we're heading for probably at least 450 and probably more like 600. And the heat implications of that are progressively much, much worse the farther you go. So anyway, his organization is an international group, very active here in the United States, particularly these days around the Keystone Pipeline, and also around student divestment campaigns to get institutions like cities and universities to stop investing in fossil fuel companies and increasingly to move that money into renewable energy. So that's his organization. Okay, thank you very much.